Yahir Graham was 43 years old and owned a small auto repair shop in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Most people believed he was an ordinary mechanic. Some thought his wife Vanessa had already outgrown him. They saw his oil-stained work jacket, his aging Ford F-150, and the same $5 coffee he bought every morning. What they didn't know was that Yahir quietly controlled a network of companies worth tens of millions of dollars. One rainy Thursday night, he stood beside his bedroom window and watched Vanessa laugh as another man opened the door of a black Mercedes S-Class for her. Then Yahir recognized the license plate, and he knew exactly who owned that car. Before we continue, take a second and tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy slow burn stories where facts matter more than noise, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's story might change the way you look at first impressions forever. The next morning looked exactly like every other morning in Grand Rapids. That was the strange thing about betrayal. The world rarely announced it. The sun still came up over the Grand River. Traffic still crawled along I-196. The same customers still stopped at Graham Auto Service with oil leaks, brake problems, and check engine lights. By 7:30, Yahir Graham was already at work. His gray work jacket hung on a hook near the service bay entrance. A fresh pot of coffee sat beside the parts counter. The smell of motor oil and rubber filled the building. Nothing about the place suggested wealth. The garage occupied a plain brick building on the west side of town. The sign above the entrance had been there for almost 20 years. The waiting room contained 3 chairs, an old television and magazines nobody read anymore. Customers trusted the place because it felt honest. Yahir preferred it that way. "Morning, boss." Mike Sanders, one of the mechanics, waved from beneath a lifted Chevrolet Silverado. Yahir nodded. "Morning." Mike had worked there 11 years. The younger technicians respected Yahir because he never acted like an owner. He worked beside them. He got dirty beside them. If a transmission needed rebuilding, he rebuilt it. No speeches, no ego, just work. By 8 o'clock, the first rush of customers had arrived. A schoolteacher needed new brakes. A plumber needed a battery replacement. A retired firefighter came in for an oil change. Yahir moved through the shop, calmly answering questions, checking repair orders, and occasionally grabbing a wrench himself. To outsiders, it looked like the life of a man doing reasonably well, but nothing more. That image had become so convincing that even Vanessa eventually believed it. Especially Vanessa. At 10:30 she called. Yahir looked at the screen before answering. "Hey." Her voice sounded distracted. "Are you coming to Melissa's fundraiser next week?" Yahir checked an invoice on his desk. "What night?" "Thursday. I have a meeting." "You always have a meeting." The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then came the familiar sigh. The disappointed one. The judgmental one. "You know," Vanessa said, "most husbands actually enjoy being seen with their wives." Yahir leaned back. "I enjoy being seen with my wife." "Not enough to leave that garage." The line went quiet again. A few years earlier, comments like that would have started arguments. Not anymore. Yahir had noticed something changing in Vanessa nearly 18 months ago. It started small. A new wardrobe, more expensive makeup, new friends, longer evenings away from home. Then came the comparisons. She compared him to executives, to investors, to husbands of her friends, to men she met at charity events, always successful men, always visible men, always loud men. "You could do more with yourself," she often said. The statement never made sense to Yahir. Not because it was offensive, because it was inaccurate. But he never corrected her. He simply listened. Over time, the criticism became sharper. She complained about his truck, his clothes, his schedule, his reluctance to attend social events, his preference for simple restaurants instead of upscale places downtown. The irony was almost funny. The Ford F-150 she mocked had been paid off for years. The jacket she hated cost less than one of her handbags. The garage she dismissed generated enough revenue to support hundreds of employees through various companies she didn't even know existed. Yet Yahir never defended himself. Defending himself would require explanations. Explanations created attention. Attention created risk. And Yahir had spent nearly 2 decades learning the value of privacy. Around noon, Vanessa posted a photo on social media. Yahir saw it during lunch. She sat at an outdoor cafe in downtown Grand Rapids. Perfect makeup, designer sunglasses, a glass of white wine. The caption read, "Life is too short to think small." Hundreds of likes followed. Several comments appeared beneath it. "Beautiful, living your best life? You deserve happiness." Yahir stared at the screen for a moment. Then he locked the phone and returned to work. The comments didn't bother him. What bothered him were the details, because details told stories. And lately, Vanessa's details had changed. 3 months ago, she started carrying her phone everywhere. 2 months ago, she changed her passcode. 6 weeks ago, she began stepping outside for certain calls. 4 weeks ago, she started smiling at messages she never shared. 2 weeks ago, she stopped asking Yahir when he'd be home. The pattern was obvious. The evidence wasn't, and Yahir believed in evidence, not assumptions. Evidence, that was why he hadn't confronted her outside the window the previous night. He had watched, observed, remembered. Nothing more. At 3 in the afternoon, a customer recognized him from a local business magazine. The man pointed toward the framed article hanging near the office. "Didn't they feature you a few years back?" Yahir smiled politely. "I think so. Successful guy. Just lucky." The customer laughed. "Nobody gets lucky for 20 years." Yahir changed the subject, as always. The article itself revealed very little. It mentioned Graham Auto Service, community involvement, local business awards. Nothing about Graham Holdings. Nothing about subsidiary ownership. Nothing about executive rental fleets. That was intentional. When people underestimated him, they became comfortable. Comfortable people showed their true intentions. The lesson had served Yahir well in business. Now it was serving him in marriage. The workday ended shortly after 6. Most employees headed home. Yahir stayed behind. The garage grew quiet. Tools stopped rattling. Engines stopped running. The building settled into silence. He sat alone in his office. A single desk lamp illuminated stacks of paperwork. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Slow, steady, like the night before. Yahir opened a drawer. Inside was a small notebook, nothing fancy, just black leather. He flipped through several pages. Dates, times, observations. Nothing emotional, nothing dramatic, only facts. He turned to a fresh page, then wrote down the license plate number he had memorized the previous evening. Every digit, every letter. Perfectly. He stared at it for several seconds. The number meant something now. Not because of the car, because of what came next. Most people would have called their spouse, started a fight, demanded answers, made threats. Yahir did none of those things. Instead, he opened his laptop, logged into a secure system, and typed the plate number into a search field he rarely used. The results appeared almost instantly. Yahir read the first line, then the second, then the third. His expression never changed, but his eyes narrowed slightly, because the black Mercedes parked outside his house the night before wasn't just familiar. It belonged to a company he knew better than anyone alive, and the name attached to the rental agreement made everything suddenly very clear. Brandon Pierce. For the first time, Yahir had something more valuable than suspicion. He had a trail, and trails had a way of leading somewhere. The search result remained on Yahir Graham's screen long after the office had gone quiet. He wasn't surprised, not completely. What surprised him was how quickly the pieces were beginning to fit together. Outside, rain continued to fall over Grand Rapids. Inside the office, the only sound came from the soft hum of the computer. Yahir studied the information carefully. No assumptions, no emotions, just facts. The license plate belonged to a 2024 black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Vehicle status active rental. Company Great Lakes Executive Rentals. Customer Brandon Pierce. Yahir clicked the next page. The rental profile opened. Most people would have recognized Great Lakes Executive Rentals as a successful luxury vehicle company operating throughout Michigan. High-end sedans, executive SUVs, corporate transportation contracts, airport services, private clients. What most people didn't know was who actually owned it. The public records showed Great Lakes Executive Rentals as a subsidiary of Graham Mobility Ventures. Graham Mobility Ventures reported to Graham Holdings Group, and Graham Holdings Group belonged to one man, Yahir Graham. Even Vanessa didn't know the full structure. Years ago, Yahir had intentionally separated his businesses. Every company had its own management, its own accounting, its own executives, its own legal protections. The arrangement wasn't about secrecy, it was about stability. If one company suffered a problem, the others remained protected. The system had taken nearly 20 years to build. Now, it was protecting him in an entirely different way. Yahir opened the rental agreement. Brandon Pierce, age 35, occupation listed as real estate broker. Business name Pierce Premier Realty. Rental term extended executive lease. Vehicle value $142,000. Security deposit approved. Monthly charges current. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then Yahir kept reading and noticed something interesting. The lease contained 3 warnings. No unauthorized drivers. No commercial misuse. No transfer of possession. Violations triggered immediate review. Standard language, nothing unusual. Until he opened the vehicle activity report. That was where the details lived. And details always mattered. Yahir clicked through 30 days of records. The system automatically tracked mileage, GPS activity, service alerts, maintenance reports, vehicle access logs. Every luxury rental in the fleet carried advanced tracking. Insurance companies required it. Fleet managers depended on it. Customers rarely thought about it. The first week showed routine travel. Downtown Grand Rapids, client meetings, office visits, restaurants. Nothing remarkable. The second week became more interesting. The Mercedes spent repeated evenings at locations that didn't match Brandon's listed address. Several overnight stops appeared. A condominium tower downtown, an upscale hotel, a private parking garage. Yahir kept scrolling. His face remained expressionless. The report didn't tell stories. It simply recorded movement. Movement told enough. Then he noticed another section. Driver authentication alerts. His eyes narrowed. There were 6 entries, 6. The Mercedes used a digital access system connected to the rental app. Every time someone other than the registered user operated the vehicle, the system generated a notice. Most customers called customer support to add authorized drivers. The process took minutes. Brandon never did. Yahir opened the first alert. Date, time, location, driver identity estimate. The system didn't guarantee accuracy, but it was usually reliable. The first alert appeared outside a shopping center. The second appeared near a downtown restaurant. The third appeared near Vanessa's fitness club. The fourth, The fifth, the sixth, all pointed toward the same conclusion. The software estimated the unauthorized driver was female, approximately Vanessa's height, approximately Vanessa's weight. Yahir leaned back in his chair. The room felt very still. Not because he was angry, because confirmation had weight. Suspicion lived in possibilities. Evidence lived in facts, and facts changed everything. A few moments later, his office phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Derek Lawson. Yahir answered. "Derek. Working late again?" "Looks like it." Derek laughed softly. That's never a good sign. Derek Lawson had served as operations director for Great Lakes Executive Rentals for almost 8 years. Reliable, careful, loyal, most importantly, discreet. "You need something?" Derek asked. "Possibly." A short pause followed. "Personal, very." That immediately changed Derek's tone. "Understood." Yahir rotated his chair toward the window. Rainwater slid down the glass. "I need a complete activity package for a rental account." "Which one?" "Brandon Pierce." Silence. Then Derek replied. "The real estate guy. You know him only by reputation." "What reputation?" Another pause. "Likes attention." That sounded accurate, Derek continued. "He rents expensive vehicles whenever he's trying to impress clients." "Anything else?" "Nothing serious, at least nothing that's reached my desk." Yahir glanced at the screen. "Send me everything." "GPS, yes." "Maintenance history, yes." "Access logs, everything." Derek didn't ask questions. That was one reason Yahir trusted him. "You'll have it tomorrow morning." "Appreciate it." The call ended. Yahir sat quietly for another minute, then returned to the file. Brandon Pierce. The name felt increasingly familiar. Not from business, from Vanessa. She had mentioned him before, several times. Always casually, always indirectly. A realtor helping a friend, a guy from a charity event, someone connected to a development project. At the time, the references meant nothing. Now they meant everything. Yahir opened social media. He searched Brandon's name. The profile appeared immediately. Thousands of followers. Luxury photos, private clubs, expensive restaurants, designer suits, champagne, vacation pictures, a carefully manufactured life. Yahir continued scrolling, then stopped. One photograph showed Brandon standing beside a black Mercedes. The same Mercedes. The caption read, "Built, earned, deserved." Hundreds of comments praised his success. Yahir looked at the timestamp. 3 weeks ago. Technically, the statement wasn't true. Brandon hadn't built it, hadn't earned it, and certainly didn't own it. But the people reading the post didn't know that. Vanessa probably didn't either. Or maybe she wanted to believe it. Sometimes people preferred attractive stories over ordinary truth. The ordinary truth was standing in the repair garage every morning wearing an oil-stained jacket. The attractive story wore tailored suits and posed beside luxury vehicles. Yahir understood the difference. That understanding made him valuable in business. It also made him dangerous to underestimate. At nearly 9 o'clock, he finally shut down the computer. Most men in his position might have driven home angry, might have confronted their spouse, might have demanded explanations. Yahir did none of those things. Because once a confrontation happened, people adapted. They deleted messages, changed stories, destroyed evidence, became careful. Careful people were harder to expose. And Yahir wasn't interested in arguments. He was interested in truth. The next morning arrived cold and gray. By 8 o'clock, Derek Lawson's email appeared. The subject line was simple. Pierce file package. Yahir opened it. Dozens of documents filled the folder. Rental records, GPS reports, service logs, Access data, insurance confirmations, everything Derek had promised. Yahir began reviewing them. Most confirmed what he already suspected. Then he reached the final document. Vehicle Exception Report. He opened it. A highlighted section immediately caught his attention. Unauthorized driver notifications. Driver name estimate Vanessa Graham. The report wasn't legally conclusive, but it was enough to trigger further review. More importantly, the dates matched several evenings Vanessa claimed she was attending charity committee meetings. Yahir compared the timelines, one by one. Every location aligned, every excuse aligned, every absence aligned. For the first time, the entire picture came into focus. Not because someone confessed, not because someone got caught, because the facts lined up perfectly. Yahir closed the file, then opened a new folder on his desktop. The name was simple. Documentation. He dragged every record into it, every report, every log, every timestamp, every piece of evidence. The folder continued growing, and something told him it would become much larger before this was over. Because buried near the bottom of Derek's package was another notification, a fleet compliance warning. One Yahir hadn't noticed before. The vehicle had generated repeated violations involving the same unauthorized driver. Enough violations to justify a formal investigation. Enough violations to expose much more than an affair. And Yahir had a feeling the next discovery was going to be expensive for someone. 3 days later, Vanessa suggested dinner in Detroit. The invitation came unexpectedly. Yahir was finishing paperwork in his office when her text arrived. Let's do something nice this Friday. The Whitney, 7 p.m. Nothing more, no heart emoji, no explanation, no apology for the growing distance between them. Just a location. The Whitney wasn't an ordinary restaurant. The historic mansion stood on Woodward Avenue surrounded by manicured grounds and old-money elegance. The place attracted executives, attorneys, investors, and politicians. A dinner for two could easily exceed $500. Years ago, Vanessa had loved places like that. Lately, she seemed to need them. Yahir stared at the message for several seconds before responding. Sounds good, that was all. Friday arrived cold and clear. By 6 o'clock, Yahir had finished work and driven home. Vanessa was already getting ready upstairs. When she finally came down, she looked like someone attending an event rather than dinner with her husband. Black dress, diamond earrings, perfect makeup, expensive perfume. She barely glanced at him. Instead, her eyes moved across his clothing. Dark navy suit, white shirt, black tie, simple, clean, unremarkable. The exact type of outfit Yahir preferred. Vanessa frowned. That's what you're wearing. Yahir adjusted his watch. Yes. You couldn't wear something newer. The question wasn't really a question. He looked down at the suit. It fits. Vanessa sighed. That's not the point. Yahir didn't ask what the point was. He already knew. The drive to Detroit took just over 2 hours. Most of it passed in silence. Vanessa spent much of the trip on her phone, smiling occasionally, typing rapidly, locking the screen whenever Yahir glanced in her direction. Again, he said nothing. The city lights appeared shortly before 7. Traffic flowed through downtown. Luxury apartments glowed against the night sky. Valets moved between expensive vehicles. The Whitney stood illuminated at the end of the street like something from another century. A valet opened Vanessa's door. She smiled at him. The smile looked effortless. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished wood and marble floors. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations. Business deals, celebrations, networking dinners, people performing success. The hostess escorted them to a private table near one of the mansion's large windows. Vanessa seemed pleased immediately. This was her environment, the kind of place she wished represented her daily life. The waiter arrived, wine was ordered, menus opened. For a few minutes, the evening almost felt normal. Then Vanessa started talking. Not about their marriage, not about their future, not even about her day. Instead, she spoke about other people. A couple who had purchased a lakefront home. A woman whose husband had become a venture capitalist. Another family who recently bought a second property in Florida. Every story carried the same hidden message. Look what successful people do. Yahir listened quietly. Finally, Vanessa set down her wine glass. You know what your problem is? Yahir met her eyes. No. You've never wanted more. The statement hung between them. Yahir remained silent. Vanessa continued. You could have expanded years ago. I did, she laughed lightly. I mean, really expanded. Yahir said nothing. That was the strange thing. She wasn't entirely wrong. He had expanded, more than she could possibly imagine. But because he never advertised it, she assumed it didn't exist. The waiter returned with appetizers. The conversation paused. Then a familiar voice interrupted from behind. Vanessa. She turned immediately. Too quickly, as if she already knew who would be standing there. Brandon Pierce smiled beside the table. Perfectly tailored charcoal suit, expensive watch, perfect haircut. The confidence of a man who enjoyed being observed. Vanessa widened her eyes. From Brandon. What are you doing here? The surprise looked rehearsed. Not dramatic, just slightly too polished. Brandon laughed. Meeting a client upstairs. Then he looked toward Yahir. You must be Yahir. The handshake lasted 2 seconds. Firm, measured, competitive. Brandon sat without being invited. I've heard a lot about you. Yahir doubted that, but he nodded politely. Hopefully good things. Brandon smiled. Of course. The waiter arrived again. Brandon ordered a bourbon that cost more than most people spent on dinner. Then he launched into stories. Development projects, luxury listings, investment opportunities, private clients. Every sentence sounded carefully designed to impress. Vanessa laughed at all the right moments, asked questions, leaned forward, maintained eye contact. The performance wasn't subtle anymore. Yahir noticed everything. Not because he was jealous, because he paid attention. Good businessmen paid attention. Eventually, Brandon mentioned vehicles. That topic arrived naturally enough, or perhaps intentionally. I finally upgraded my daily driver, Brandon said. Vanessa smiled. The Mercedes, Brandon grinned. The Mercedes. Then he casually placed the key fob on the table. A small gesture, but deliberate. People who truly owned expensive things rarely displayed them. People seeking validation often did. The key sat beneath the chandelier light like a trophy. Brandon noticed Yahir looking at it. You like cars, right? I do. Beautiful machine. It is. Brandon leaned back. Best purchase I've made all year. Vanessa smiled into her wine glass. Yahir looked at the key, then at Brandon, then back at the key. The statement was technically false. The Mercedes wasn't a purchase, it was a rental. A rental owned by a subsidiary Brandon didn't know belonged to Yahir, but Yahir kept that information to himself. The conversation continued. Brandon eventually shifted toward business. So, Vanessa tells me you're in automotive. I own a repair garage. Brandon nodded. Nothing wrong with that. The wording carried a familiar tone. The tone people used when pretending not to judge. Everyone starts somewhere. Vanessa laughed softly. The comment might have sounded harmless to others. It didn't sound harmless to Yahir. Not because it was insulting, because it revealed exactly what Brandon believed. He believed he occupied a higher position. He believed Yahir was beneath him. Most importantly, he believed appearances were reality. Those beliefs would become important later. Dinner continued another hour. The food was excellent. The conversation wasn't. By the time dessert arrived, Brandon finally stood. "Good seeing you both." His attention lingered on Vanessa a fraction too long. A detail most husbands might have missed. Yahir didn't. Brandon left. Vanessa watched him disappear toward the front entrance. Only then did she return her attention to the table. The check arrived shortly afterward. Vanessa glanced at it. Her expression changed slightly. The total exceeded $600. For a brief moment, uncertainty appeared. Perhaps she expected Yahir to hesitate. Perhaps she expected him to complain. Instead, he reached into his jacket, removed a black card, and handed it to the waiter. The transaction lasted seconds. Vanessa barely looked at the card. If she had, she might have noticed something. The card wasn't connected to Graham Auto Service. The embossed name belonged to Graham Holdings Group, a company she had never questioned, a company she assumed handled routine business matters. Nothing more. The waiter returned. Payment approved. Receipt signed. Dinner finished. As they walked toward the exit, Yahir glanced through the front windows. Across the street sat the black Mercedes. Its polished surface reflected city lights. Beautiful, expensive, familiar. A vehicle Brandon proudly claimed as his own. A vehicle Vanessa clearly admired. A vehicle currently generating an expanding folder of evidence on Yahir's computer. The valet opened the Mercedes door. Brandon climbed inside. A moment later, the car disappeared into Detroit traffic. Yahir watched the taillights vanish. Then something caught his attention. A notification appeared on his phone. New Fleet Compliance Alert. Vehicle Mercedes S-Class. Account Brandon Pierce. Priority Status Review recommended. Yahir stared at the screen. The timing felt almost too perfect. He opened the alert, read the first line, then the second, and realized someone had just made a mistake much larger than unauthorized driving. Yahir didn't open the compliance alert in the parking lot. He waited until he returned home. Patience had built every successful company he owned. It had also protected him from making expensive mistakes. The drive back to Grand Rapids was quiet. Vanessa spent most of it scrolling through her phone, occasionally smiling, occasionally typing. Yahir focused on the road. Streetlights passed across the windshield, mile after mile. Neither of them mentioned Brandon. Neither of them mentioned dinner. The silence itself felt revealing. When they reached home, Vanessa headed upstairs almost immediately. "Long day," she said. Yahir nodded. "Get some rest." 10 minutes later, he sat alone in his home office. The room occupied a small corner of the house overlooking the backyard. Nothing luxurious. A desk, bookshelves, a leather chair, a computer. Most visitors assumed it was where Yahir managed garage paperwork. That assumption suited him perfectly. He logged into the fleet management system. The compliance notification waited exactly where he had left it. Priority Status Review recommended. Yahir opened the file. A detailed report appeared. The alert originated from a pattern recognition system recently installed across the Great Lakes Executive Rentals fleet. The software monitored unusual behavior, unauthorized access, suspicious travel activity, repeated location matches, potential insurance violations. Most alerts turned out to be harmless. Some were not. This one fell somewhere in between. The report highlighted repeated overnight stays, multiple luxury locations, consistent driver mismatches. None of those surprised Yahir anymore. Then he reached the final section. Supporting documentation available. His eyes narrowed slightly. The system had automatically attached supporting records: hotel valet logs, parking receipts, toll transactions, vehicle access timestamps. The amount of information was impressive and useful, very useful. Yahir began downloading everything, one file after another. Each document entered a folder on his computer. Documentation. The folder was becoming larger every day. By midnight, he had created a timeline, not a theory, not a suspicion, a timeline. Dates, locations, transactions, movements, patterns. The affair was beginning to map itself. The next morning, Yahir called Derek Lawson. Derek answered immediately. "Morning. I reviewed the compliance alert. I figured you would. You mentioned everything was available." "It is." Yahir leaned back in his chair. "I want copies of every supporting record." Derek paused. "Everything. Everything." The answer came without hesitation. "No problem." Yahir trusted Derek because he understood discretion. Some executives enjoyed gossip. Derek hated it. He focused on facts. Facts were useful. Gossip wasn't. By 10 o'clock, the requested files arrived. The package contained over 70 pages. Yahir printed every one, then spread them across the conference table inside his office. For nearly 2 hours, he reviewed them carefully. The story emerging from the paperwork looked different from the story Vanessa and Brandon were probably telling themselves. Affairs often relied on fantasy. Records relied on reality. Reality was much harder to manipulate. The first interesting discovery appeared inside the GPS logs. The Mercedes had repeatedly visited the same luxury condominium tower in downtown Grand Rapids. River House Condominiums, one of the most expensive residential buildings in the city. Yahir recognized it immediately. Several corporate executives lived there. So did a few local athletes. The visits happened frequently, mostly evenings, sometimes overnight. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The second discovery appeared in the valet records. The Mercedes visited multiple high-end hotels. Not once, repeatedly. One location appeared more than any other: the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel, a historic luxury property overlooking the Grand River. Yahir opened the supporting receipts: valet tickets, parking confirmations, service records, dates, times. Everything matched. The Mercedes had spent 5 separate nights there within the last 7 weeks. 5. That alone told a story. Then came the third discovery, the one that made Yahir stop reading for several seconds. A valet service note. Most people would have ignored it. Yahir didn't. The note read, "Customer's stated vehicle personally owned. Requested premium handling. The customer was Brandon Pierce." Yahir read the sentence twice. Not because it was shocking, because it was revealing. Brandon wasn't simply borrowing status. He was actively building an identity around it. The Mercedes wasn't transportation. It was part of a performance, and performances often became expensive. Around noon, Yahir received another call. This time it came from Rachel Monroe. Rachel had represented executives, entrepreneurs, physicians, and investors throughout Michigan for nearly 20 years. She possessed a reputation for precision. People hired Rachel when emotions needed to stay out of legal matters, which made her the perfect attorney for Yahir. "You sound busy," she said. "Always." "How much have you found?" Yahir looked across the paperwork covering the table. "Enough." Rachel understood immediately. "Meaning?" "The evidence is becoming consistent." A brief silence followed. Then Rachel asked the most important question. "Have you confronted her?" "No." "Good." The answer arrived instantly, almost too quickly. Yahir wasn't offended. Rachel had seen countless clients sabotage themselves. Angry phone calls, public arguments, threats, Emotional messages. Every mistake weakened future legal positions. Rachel preferred discipline. So did Yahir. Keep collecting information, she said. No confrontation. No confrontation. What about Brandon? No. Rachel's voice remained calm. Facts first, reactions later. Yahir smiled slightly. That's usually my approach. Good. The call ended. The advice wasn't new, it simply confirmed what Yahir already believed. Evidence first, everything else later. That afternoon another package arrived from Derek. This one contained security footage. Yahir immediately opened the files. Several cameras monitored customer interactions at Great Lakes Executive Rentals. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal. Standard business operations. The footage displayed Brandon collecting the Mercedes nearly 3 months earlier. Yahir watched carefully. The video showed Brandon entering the rental office. Confident, well-dressed, smiling, the interaction lasted approximately 20 minutes. Then something unexpected happened. The front entrance opened again. Vanessa walked inside. Yahir leaned forward. This was new. The timestamp showed the footage had been recorded weeks before he noticed anything suspicious. Weeks. Vanessa approached Brandon. They exchanged a brief hug. Not a friendly greeting, not professional, personal, comfortable, familiar. The type of hug shared by people already connected. Yahir replayed the clip, then replayed it again. Not because he doubted what he saw, because timelines mattered. The footage suggested their relationship began earlier than he originally believed. Much earlier. Then another detail emerged. After completing paperwork, Brandon handed the keys to Vanessa. She entered the driver's seat. He entered the passenger seat. The Mercedes left the property. Together. The video ended. Yahir sat quietly. The office felt unusually still. Not because he was hurt. That stage had passed. The footage simply confirmed another piece of the puzzle. A larger puzzle. One that was becoming remarkably clear. Late that evening, Yahir continued reviewing documents. Hours passed. The stack gradually shrank. Then he reached the final folder. Hotel records. Inside were multiple receipts connected to valet services. Most appeared routine. One stood out immediately. The receipt included vehicle information, guest information, date, room reference, and an attached note from a valet supervisor. The supervisor had documented a customer complaint. Nothing major, just standard customer service paperwork. Yet one sentence caught Yahir's attention. The customer had requested discretion regarding vehicle registration ownership. Yahir stared at the line. Slowly, carefully. People only requested discretion when they believed ownership mattered, which meant Brandon knew something. Maybe not everything, but something. Enough to be concerned, enough to ask questions, enough to worry. Yahir placed the document aside, then opened another, and another. Eventually, he reached a file that immediately changed the direction of the entire investigation. The document contained business account information associated with Brandon's rental agreement, a company account, corporate billing authorization, business references. At first glance, everything looked normal. Then Yahir noticed a discrepancy, a small one, easy to miss, but potentially significant. The listed business information didn't match publicly available records. Not exactly. The numbers were close. The names were similar, but not identical, and that meant only one thing. Someone had provided inaccurate information during the rental approval process. Whether intentional or accidental remained unclear. For now. Yahir closed the file. His instincts sharpened immediately. Because affairs were messy, but financial discrepancies. Financial discrepancies created paper trails. and paper trails had a habit of leading somewhere much bigger. The discrepancy stayed in Yahir Graham's mind for 2 days. Not because it was dramatic, because it was precise. Small inaccuracies often revealed larger problems. A person willing to misrepresent one detail usually felt comfortable misrepresenting others. That principle had saved Yahir millions of dollars throughout his business career. Now it was helping him understand Brandon Pierce. Tuesday morning began like any other. The garage opened at 7:30. Customers arrived. Repairs started. Invoices moved across desks. The ordinary rhythm of Graham Auto Service continued uninterrupted. No one looking at Yahir would have guessed that an expanding investigation occupied the back of his mind. He changed brake pads before lunch, reviewed employee schedules, approved equipment purchases, answered customer questions. The routine never changed. The discipline helped. People often underestimated the power of routine. Routine kept emotions from taking control. Around 11, Derek Lawson called. "I found something." Yahir closed the repair estimate he was reviewing. "What is it?" "The hotel records." "Which hotel?" "Amway Grand Plaza." That got Yahir's attention immediately. The Amway Grand appeared more frequently than any other location in the GPS reports. "What about it?" Derek hesitated briefly. "You're going to want to see this yourself." "That serious?" "Potentially." Yahir glanced through the office window toward the service bays. "I'll head over this afternoon." "Good." The call ended. 3 hours later, Yahir parked outside the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. The historic building overlooked the Grand River. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Valets moved efficiently between guests. Business travelers entered through revolving doors. Nothing looked unusual. That was the thing about secrets. They rarely advertised themselves. Inside, the lobby buzzed with activity. Yahir walked calmly through the crowd. Several employees recognized him, not as a garage owner, as something else. Great Lakes Executive Rentals had maintained corporate partnerships with several luxury hotels throughout Michigan for years, including this one. A valet supervisor spotted him almost immediately. "Mr. Graham." Yahir offered a polite handshake. "Good afternoon." The supervisor's name was Kevin Reynolds. 40 years old, professional, reliable. Derek had worked with him on several fleet agreements. Kevin led Yahir toward a quieter office near the valet operations desk. Once the door closed, the noise of the hotel disappeared. Kevin opened a folder. "We pulled everything connected to the Mercedes." Yahir sat down. "Let's see it." The folder contained valet logs, parking tickets, vehicle arrival records, driver notes, standard documentation. Most of it matched information Yahir already possessed. Then Kevin turned to a particular page. "This is the one Derek mentioned." Yahir studied the document. The record came from 6 weeks earlier. Valet arrival time 7:12 p.m. Vehicle Mercedes S-Class. Customer Brandon Pierce. Attached notes available. Kevin pointed toward the supporting report. "One of my newer valets filed this." Yahir began reading. The note described a conversation during vehicle drop-off. Nothing unusual initially. Then the details changed. Customer stated vehicle personally owned. Customer requested priority handling. Customer referenced multiple commercial developments. Customer claimed executive ownership position. Yahir looked up. Kevin shrugged. "We hear things all the time." "I'm sure." But that's not the interesting part. Kevin produced another document. A security still image. Yahir immediately recognized the people. Brandon, Vanessa. The photograph showed them entering the hotel together. Close together. Comfortable together. The timestamp matched one of the evenings Vanessa claimed she was attending a charity planning meeting. Another lie confirmed. Still, Yahir remained calm. He had passed the point of needing emotional validation. Evidence spoke for itself. "What happened after this?" he asked. Kevin opened another file. The answer surprised him. The valet staff had experienced a complaint the following morning. Not from Brandon, from another guest. Apparently, Brandon had spent nearly 20 minutes in the valet area discussing his business success with several employees. Most people ignored such behavior. One employee documented it because Brandon repeatedly emphasized vehicle ownership. Ownership, again. That word kept appearing. Not luxury, not success. Ownership. Almost as if Brandon needed people to believe it. The pattern intrigued Yahir, because truly wealthy people rarely introduce themselves through possessions. People seeking status often did. As the meeting continued, another detail emerged. A billing issue. Minor. Almost insignificant. Yet it immediately captured Yahir's attention. The hotel's corporate records showed Brandon had attempted to charge services to a business account. The name listed was Pierce Premier Realty Group. Yahir recognized it immediately. That was the company attached to the rental agreement. The same company involved in the discrepancy Derek had discovered. "Do you still have the account information?" Yahir asked. Kevin nodded. "We do." He slid another sheet across the desk. Business name, account number, authorization contact, corporate billing address. Yahir examined everything carefully. Then he noticed it. The address. Not completely wrong, not completely right. Just different enough to matter. A variation, a modification, an adjustment. The type of thing people did when attempting to create legitimacy, not outright fraud. Something subtler. Something harder to notice. Yahir folded the document and placed it into his folder. The pieces were slowly aligning, and each new piece pointed toward the same conclusion. Brandon's public image appeared significantly larger than his actual financial reality. When the meeting ended, Kevin walked Yahir back toward the lobby. They passed the valet station on the way out. Several employees greeted him. One younger valet suddenly paused. Recognition crossed his face. "Wait." The young man looked between Yahir and the Mercedes photo sitting partially visible inside the folder. "You own Great Lakes Executive Rentals, right?" Yahir nodded. The valet smiled. "I thought so." Then he added something unexpected. "That guy with the Mercedes talked about owning it every time he came here." Yahir said nothing. The valet continued. "He even corrected another employee once." "Corrected him." "Yeah." The valet laughed awkwardly. "One of us mentioned it looked like a rental. He got pretty defensive." "Interesting. Very interesting." Yahir thanked him and left. Outside, the afternoon air felt cool. Clouds drifted above the river. Traffic moved steadily across downtown Grand Rapids. Yahir remained seated in his truck for several minutes before starting the engine. His thoughts weren't focused on the affair anymore. The affair was obvious. The larger issue was becoming something else. Identity, image, money, the stories people told, the records they created, the inconsistencies between them. Back at the garage, Yahir locked himself inside his office. He spread the new documents across the desk. Hotel records, billing records, corporate references, addresses, names, numbers. Patterns emerged almost immediately. One inconsistency led to another, then another. By evening, he had assembled a new timeline. Not of relationships, and of business activity, and the timeline revealed something unexpected. The same business account appeared repeatedly, not only with the rental company, not only with the hotel. Several additional references surfaced across expense reports and authorization records. Too many. Far too many. The company seemed larger on paper than it should have been. Yahir opened public business records, then searched Pierce Premier Realty Group. The results appeared instantly. He stared at them, then searched again. Same result. The information didn't match. Not completely. The discrepancies were becoming impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Yahir suspected Brandon's problems extended far beyond pretending to own a Mercedes. Someone had been creating a financial illusion, a carefully maintained one. The question was simple: who was funding it? As Yahir continued reviewing records, one final transaction report surfaced. A payment connected to Brandon's rental account. A payment source that definitely did not belong to his company. The account holder's name appeared clearly on the screen. Yahir read it once, then again, because the name attached to the transfer was someone he knew very well. Vanessa Graham. Yahir stared at the screen for nearly 10 seconds. Not because he couldn't believe it, because he wanted to be certain. The payment record remained unchanged. Account holder Vanessa Graham. Transfer amount $4,800. Transaction reference lease payment support. Date 7 weeks earlier. Yahir leaned back slowly. Outside his office window, mechanics continued working in the service bays. Air tools hissed. Engines started and stopped. Customers came and went. Normal life continued. Inside the office, however, another piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. The Mercedes wasn't supporting Brandon's image. Vanessa was supporting Brandon's image. That changed everything. Until now, Yahir had viewed Brandon as a man pretending to be wealthier than he actually was. Now, another possibility emerged. Perhaps Brandon's entire lifestyle depended on someone else, and that someone might be Vanessa. Yahir immediately forwarded the records to Rachel Monroe. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. "Tell me, this is what I think it is," Rachel said. Yahir looked at the transfer report. "It appears to be." Rachel remained quiet for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice sounded sharper. "Do you have access to the originating account?" "Not directly." "But you recognize it?" "Yes," Rachel sighed. "This is important." "I assumed so." "No, more important than the affair." That statement caught Yahir's attention. Rachel rarely exaggerated. "Explain. Affairs are emotional. And this isn't, this is financial." Yahir understood immediately. Courts viewed emotions one way, money another, especially marital money. Rachel continued. "If she's moving joint funds to support another relationship, that's a completely different conversation." The distinction mattered a lot. "Keep digging," Rachel said. "I plan to." The call ended. Yahir sat quietly for a moment, then opened another set of records. The payment from Vanessa wasn't isolated. 3 additional transactions appeared, smaller amounts, different dates, different references, but the same destination: Brandon Pierce. One payment covered a vehicle extension fee. Another covered a security deposit adjustment. A third appeared connected to a luxury condominium application. Yahir began building a new spreadsheet. Rows, columns, dates, amounts, sources, destinations. The picture became clearer with every entry. By lunchtime, one conclusion seemed unavoidable. Brandon's finances were weaker than his public image suggested. Much weaker. That afternoon, Yahir called Marcus Bell. Rachel had recommended him years ago during a business dispute. Marcus specialized in financial investigations. If money moved, Marcus could usually find it. They met at a coffee shop near downtown Grand Rapids. Marcus arrived carrying a tablet and 2 folders. 50 years old, former forensic accountant, patient, methodical, the type of person who preferred spreadsheets to conversations. After brief introductions, Yahir handed him copies of the records. Marcus spent nearly 15 minutes reviewing them. No interruptions. No comments. Just reading. Finally, he looked up. "You want the truth?" "Always." Marcus tapped the documents. "This guy isn't funding his own image," Yahir nodded. "That's my impression." "It's more than an impression." Marcus pointed toward the payment history. "Look here." Several highlighted entries appeared. Late payments, then another section. Adjusted payments, then another. Partial payments. Yahir studied the information. "What does that tell you?" Marcus smiled faintly. "It tells me he's constantly chasing cash flow." That wasn't surprising. Many businesses experienced cash flow issues. Marcus wasn't finished. "Now, look at the timing. The dates aligned with Vanessa's transfers. Almost perfectly. Whenever Brandon missed a payment, money appeared. Sometimes within hours, sometimes within a day, but always appeared. Like clockwork, Yahir looked out the coffee shop window. Rain clouds gathered over the city. What else? Marcus opened another report. Public business records, tax filings, property records, commercial registrations. The information painted a very different picture than Brandon's social media profile. The luxury lifestyle existed, but the financial foundation beneath it looked unstable. A leased office, minimal assets, several revolving debts, no major commercial holdings, no significant property portfolio, no evidence of the wealth Brandon constantly displayed online. "Interesting," Yahir said. Marcus laughed softly. "That's one word for it." "What word would you use?" "Fragile." The answer felt accurate. Very accurate. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, Marcus had agreed to perform a deeper review. Nothing illegal, nothing invasive. Simply a comprehensive financial analysis using available records. As they stood to leave, Marcus paused. "One more thing." Yahir waited. "The people who build real wealth usually hide it. And the people who constantly display wealth usually need witnesses." That observation stayed with Yahir long after the meeting ended, because it described Brandon perfectly, and perhaps Vanessa as well. 3 days later, Marcus called. His tone suggested he had found something significant. "Can you come by my office?" "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The office occupied the 3rd floor of a commercial building downtown. Stacks of files covered nearly every surface. Marcus greeted him without wasting time, then handed over a report. 37 pages. Detailed. Thorough. Disturbing. Yahir began reading. The report confirmed most of their earlier conclusions. Brandon's financial position remained far weaker than publicly advertised. Several business expenses exceeded normal operating levels. Multiple accounts carried unusually low balances. And perhaps most importantly, outside funding appeared repeatedly. Not loans, not investors, personal transfers. The largest source, Vanessa Graham. Yahir turned another page, then another. Each one added more detail. The transfers stretched back nearly 9 months. 9, far longer than he expected. The total amount eventually appeared near the bottom of the report. Yahir stared at it. $67,400. For a moment, the room felt unusually quiet. Not because of the amount itself, because of what it represented. $67,000 wasn't a mistake. It wasn't impulse spending. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate pattern. A sustained pattern. Marcus folded his hands. "That's not the interesting part." Yahir looked up. "There's more." "Oh, yes." Marcus slid another document across the desk. Bank transfer descriptions, reference notes, transaction labels. Most appeared ordinary. Vehicle, rent, consulting, marketing. Then one label appeared, and immediately stood apart. Fresh Start Fund. The transfer totaled $25,000, the largest payment in the entire report. The date was recent, very recent, less than 3 weeks old. Yahir read it again. Fresh Start Fund. The wording bothered him. Not because it was dramatic, because it sounded intentional, planned, future-oriented. Marcus watched him carefully. You thinking what I'm thinking? Probably. They're preparing for something. Yahir nodded slowly. A new apartment, a relocation, a future together. Any of those possibilities fit. The payment suggested planning, not spontaneity, which meant the affair wasn't simply emotional. It was strategic. Someone had been preparing an exit and using marital resources to do it. Marcus leaned forward. There's one final thing. Yahir waited. Marcus handed him another page. The document contained account information connected to the Fresh Start Fund transfer, destination account, receiving institution, beneficiary details. Yahir scanned the page, then stopped. The account wasn't registered solely to Brandon. A second name appeared beside his. A joint beneficiary. Yahir felt his pulse slow. Not increase, slow. The way it always did when something important finally became clear. Because the second name on that account wasn't unfamiliar. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't coded. It was written plainly. Vanessa Graham. For the first time, Yahir wasn't looking at an affair. He was looking at a plan. And plans left trails. The question now wasn't whether Vanessa intended to leave. The question was how much of Yahir's life she intended to take with her when she did. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Not by mail, not through a difficult conversation, not after an honest discussion about the state of the marriage. A process server walked directly into Graham Auto Service at 10:17 a.m. 3 mechanics looked up from their work. A customer waiting for an oil change glanced toward the front counter. The process server asked a simple question. Yahir Graham. Yahir stepped forward. That's me. The man handed him a thick envelope. Professional, polite, efficient. Then he left. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. No drama, no raised voices, no public embarrassment. Just paperwork. Yahir looked down at the envelope. Family Court of Kent County. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The moment felt strangely calm. Not because he expected it that day, because he had expected it eventually. The signs had been there for months. The transfers, the joint account, the affair, the planning. The Fresh Start Fund. Now the final piece had arrived. Vanessa had made her move. Mike Sanders approached carefully. You okay, boss? Yahir nodded. Fine. Mike glanced toward the envelope. Need anything? No. The answer ended the conversation. Mike respected boundaries. Most of the employees did. They returned to work. The garage continued operating. Brake jobs, oil changes, customer appointments. Life moved forward. By noon, Yahir sat alone inside his office reading every page. Once, then a second time, then a third. Each review revealed more. The petition painted a very specific picture of his life, or at least Vanessa's version of it. Yahir almost admired the confidence. Almost. According to the filing, Vanessa described her husband as the owner of a modest automotive repair business. A hard-working man, financially stable, comfortable, but limited. The language appeared carefully chosen. The image was clear: a small business owner, middle-class lifestyle, predictable income, predictable assets, predictable future. Yahir set the document down. The irony would have been funny under different circumstances. Vanessa had spent years living beside one of the most successful entrepreneurs in Western Michigan, and somehow she still believed he only owned a repair shop. The filing continued. Requests for marital property division, requests for support, requests for asset disclosures, requests for valuation reviews. The numbers became increasingly ambitious: the marital home, portions of business interests, retirement accounts, investment assets, future income considerations. Yahir read every word carefully. Then he called Rachel Monroe. She answered immediately. "You got served." Not a question, a statement. "How did you know?" Rachel laughed softly. "Because I got a copy 30 minutes ago." That sounded like Rachel, always one step ahead. "What do you think?" Yahir asked. "Honestly, yes. I think she's operating on incomplete information." Yahir leaned back. "That's my impression, too." Rachel paused, then added something interesting. "No, it's worse than that." Worse. She's making assumptions. That got his attention. Rachel continued. "People can work with incomplete information. But assumptions create mistakes." Yahir looked again at the paperwork covering his desk. "What mistake?" "The biggest one possible." Rachel's voice remained calm. "She believes she understands your assets." The truth was simple. She didn't, not remotely. Years earlier, when Graham Holdings began expanding, Yahir intentionally separated ownership structures, not to hide wealth, to protect operations. Every acquisition entered a different entity. Every entity maintained separate reporting, separate management, separate accounting, separate liabilities. The arrangement created stability. It also created distance. Distance Vanessa never bothered to explore. Rachel continued. "I spent the morning reviewing everything. And the filing barely mentions Graham Holdings." Yahir wasn't surprised. Vanessa rarely discussed it. Most of the time she referred to it as one of Yahir's business corporations. Nothing more, nothing important, nothing worth understanding. That assumption now appeared in her legal filing. Rachel turned another page, then laughed, a genuine laugh. "What?" "You'll appreciate this." Yahir waited. "Apparently, Brandon Pierce is driving around pretending he owns a Mercedes." Yahir smiled slightly. Apparently, Rachel wasn't finished. And based on the language here, I think Vanessa believes him. For the first time that day, Yahir actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough, because Rachel was probably right. Vanessa had spent months admiring the Mercedes. Months watching Brandon display it. Months building plans around him. Yet she never once checked who owned the vehicle. Never once verified anything. She accepted the image, the story, the performance, exactly as Brandon presented it. Rachel's tone became serious again. "That's going to matter later." "Why?" "Because perception creates expectations. And expectations become dangerous when reality arrives." The conversation lasted another hour. By the end, Rachel had outlined their strategy. No emotional responses, no aggressive actions, no public accusations. Everything would proceed through documentation, records, contracts, financial disclosures, evidence, exactly the way Yahir preferred. That evening, he returned home. Vanessa was already there. The atmosphere inside the house felt different. Not tense, final. The papers had changed something, even if neither person mentioned them. She'd stood in the kitchen reviewing something on her tablet. When Yahir entered, she looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Vanessa broke the silence. "I assume you've seen the filing." "Yes." Another pause. She seemed surprised by how calm he sounded. Perhaps she expected anger. Perhaps she wanted it. Instead, Yahir poured himself a glass of water. Nothing more. Vanessa crossed her arms. "You don't have anything to say." He considered the question, then answered honestly. "Not right now." The response unsettled her. He could see it. Because people often prepare for conflict. They prepare for shouting, arguments, emotional reactions. They rarely prepare for silence. Vanessa looked away first. The conversation ended. Later that night, Yahir sat in his office reviewing the petition again. Not because he needed to, because patterns interested him. One section caught his attention. Asset references, specific properties, specific business interests, specific assumptions. The wording revealed exactly what Vanessa believed, and exactly what she didn't know. She listed Graham Auto Service, of course. She referenced a handful of public investments, also expected. She referenced personal accounts, reasonable. What she never mentioned was far more important. No mention of Graham Mobility Ventures. No mention of Great Lakes Executive Rentals. No mention of multiple subsidiaries. No mention of commercial holdings. No mention of transportation contracts. No mention of licensing operations. Nothing. The absence was enormous. Rachel had been right. Vanessa wasn't filing from a position of knowledge. She was filing from a position of confidence. Those weren't the same thing. Around midnight, an email arrived from Rachel. Subject preliminary review notes. Yahir opened it. Attached were several observations, several legal considerations, several warnings. Then, one sentence near the bottom immediately stood out. She believes the rental fleet belongs to Brandon. Yahir stared at the screen. Slowly. Carefully. Because that single misunderstanding explained everything. The admiration. The confidence, the future plans. The assumptions. Vanessa genuinely believed Brandon owned the lifestyle he displayed. The Mercedes, the image, the success, the status. And if she believed that she was about to walk into a legal process carrying completely inaccurate expectations. Yahir closed the email, then looked toward the dark window beside his desk. The reflection, staring back, looked calm, patient, focused, because for the first time since that rainy night outside the bedroom window, he understood exactly what was happening. Vanessa had already decided she was leaving. She believed she knew who was winning, and she believed she knew what the future looked like. The problem was that almost every assumption supporting that future was wrong, and very soon those assumptions would be tested under oath. The deposition took place 6 weeks later. By then, autumn had settled over western Michigan. Trees around downtown Grand Rapids had turned shades of gold and copper. Cold wind swept through the streets. Inside the law offices of Monroe and Bartlett, however, the temperature remained carefully controlled. Everything about the conference room felt deliberate. Neutral walls, dark wood table, filtered light, no distractions, just people, documents, and questions. Yahir arrived 15 minutes early. Not because he was nervous, because he believed punctuality revealed character. He wore a simple navy suit, no luxury watch, no visible symbols of wealth, nothing designed to impress. The appearance matched the image people expected. The owner of a successful repair garage. Nothing more. Rachel Monroe sat beside him, reviewing notes. Across the room, several bankers' boxes contained documents prepared over the previous months. Corporate records, financial disclosures, asset reports, ownership structures, evidence files. Thousands of pages. Vanessa entered shortly before 9. She looked confident. Confident enough that Yahir noticed it immediately. Her posture was straight, her expression controlled. Her attorney, Robert Hensley, walked beside her, carrying a slim portfolio. That detail interested Yahir. Slim, very slim. Rachel's preparation filled multiple boxes. Theirs fit inside a single leather case. Confidence often reduced preparation. The two weren't always compatible. Vanessa looked at Yahir briefly. Only briefly. No smile, no anger. just certainty. The certainty of someone who believed the outcome was already understood. Several minutes later, another familiar face appeared. Brandon Pierce. He wore an expensive charcoal suit, polished shoes, designer tie. The same image he projected everywhere: successful, established, winning, at least on the surface. Yahir watched him take a seat near the far end of the room. Brandon never looked directly at him. That detail didn't escape Yahir. At precisely 9 o'clock, the deposition began. Formal introductions, procedural instructions, recording confirmations, then questions. The first hour focused primarily on the marriage, length of relationship, joint assets, shared expenses, residential arrangements, routine matters. Nothing dramatic, nothing unexpected. Vanessa answered confidently. Robert Hensley guided the conversation carefully. The strategy became obvious. Paint Yahir as a small business owner, create a limited financial profile, establish modest expectations, reduce perceived asset value. It wasn't a terrible strategy, if the assumptions were correct. Unfortunately for them, they weren't. The first significant moment arrived when Robert turned toward Yahir. "Mr. Graham, you currently own Graham Auto Service, correct?" "Yes." "And that is your primary business." Rachel didn't move, didn't object, didn't interrupt. She simply waited. Yahir answered truthfully. "It is one of my businesses." The room became slightly quieter. Robert looked down at his notes. "One of your businesses?" "Yes." The attorney adjusted his glasses. "Can you explain?" Rachel finally spoke. "We'll be happy to provide clarification." Robert nodded. "Please do." Rachel opened the first box. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply opened it, then removed a stack of documents. The sound of paper sliding across the table seemed unusually loud. Corporate formation records, ownership disclosures, business registrations, one document after another. Rachel placed them neatly in front of the court reporter, then in front of Robert, then in front of Vanessa. For the first time that morning, Vanessa looked genuinely confused. Rachel began calmly. "Mr. Graham owns Graham Auto Service." She placed one document forward. "He also owns Graham Holdings Group," another document. "He also owns Graham Mobility Ventures." Another, and several subsidiary entities operating under those structures. Silence. The kind of silence created when expectations collide with reality. Robert blinked, then reached for the first document. His expression changed almost immediately. He picked up another, then another. The room remained quiet. Yahir watched Vanessa, not because he wanted satisfaction, because observation had become habit. The confidence was still there, but something else had appeared beside it. Uncertainty, small, subtle, yet unmistakable. Rachel continued. Her voice never changed. No triumph, no arrogance, just facts. Graham Holdings Group maintains interests in transportation services, commercial fleet operations, logistics contracts, licensing agreements, and several private investment vehicles. More documents appeared. More records. More ownership disclosures. Every statement carried supporting evidence. Every claim connected to documentation. Yahir noticed Brandon shifting slightly in his chair. The movement lasted less than a second. Still, it mattered, because Brandon suddenly looked less comfortable. Robert cleared his throat. "Can we discuss valuations?" "Certainly," Rachel replied. Another stack of records appeared. Independent assessments, corporate audits, revenue summaries, ownership percentages. The table gradually filled. What had started as a straightforward divorce deposition was becoming something much larger. Vanessa looked down at the documents, then at Yahir, then back at the documents. For years, she had criticized his old truck, his work clothes, his schedule, his garage. Now, the paperwork told a different story. Not a hidden story, a documented one. One she had simply never bothered to understand. The deposition continued. Questions became more detailed. Corporate structures, ownership layers, subsidiary operations, revenue channels. Nothing illegal, nothing secret. Simply complicated. And complexity often confused people who relied on appearances. Around midday, Rachel introduced another set of documents. These focused specifically on transportation assets, fleet operations, rental contracts, vehicle ownership records. Yahir immediately recognized where the conversation was heading. So did Rachel. That was why she moved slowly, carefully, like someone revealing pieces of a puzzle one at a time. Eventually, she reached a specific document, a fleet ownership summary. The title appeared clearly across the page, Great Lakes Executive Rentals. For the first time all morning, Brandon looked directly at the document. His reaction lasted only a fraction of a second, but Yahir saw it. Surprise, real surprise. Rachel slid copies across the table. One reached Robert, one reached Vanessa, one reached Brandon. The silence returned. Heavier this time. Because unlike the earlier disclosures, this one connected to something personal, something familiar. Something sitting in Brandon's parking space every night. Rachel spoke calmly. Great Lakes Executive Rentals operates under Graham Mobility Ventures. She paused, then added, which is owned by Graham Holdings Group. No one interrupted. No one objected, because the paperwork spoke clearly enough. Yahir watched Vanessa read the page. Once, then again, then a third time. Her eyes moved through ownership records, corporate signatures, registration filings, operating disclosures. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. The rental company belonged to Yahir, not Brandon, not some anonymous corporation, Yahir. A slight crease formed between Vanessa's eyes. For the first time since filing for divorce, she appeared genuinely uncertain. Brandon looked worse, much worse, because his expression suggested something different. Recognition. As if a question he had never considered suddenly demanded an answer. Rachel closed the folder. Not because she had finished, because she had accomplished exactly what she intended. Reality had entered the room. The rest would follow naturally. The deposition recessed briefly for lunch. People stood, collected notes, made phone calls, stepped into hallways. Yahir remained seated, calm as ever. Rachel organized documents beside him. Neither spoke for several moments. Then Rachel finally looked up. "Did you see their faces?" Yahir nodded. "Yes." "They didn't know." "No." Rachel smiled slightly. "No, they really didn't know." The statement lingered, because ignorance had fueled every assumption Vanessa and Brandon made. The Mercedes, the lifestyle, the future, the divorce. Everything rested on incomplete information. And now, that information was beginning to collapse. As the lunch recess ended, Rachel opened another file. A much smaller file. One labeled with a single name. Brandon Pierce. She placed it on top of the stack, then looked toward Yahir. "We start there this afternoon." Yahir glanced at the folder, then at Brandon across the room. Because if the morning had changed the atmosphere, the afternoon was about to change something far more important. The story of who actually owned that Mercedes was finally about to become public record. The afternoon session began at 1:07 p.m. By then, the atmosphere inside the conference room had changed. The confidence that filled the room that morning had faded. Not disappeared, just weakened. Facts had a way of doing that. People could argue with opinions. They could challenge emotions. Documents were harder, especially when every document connected to another. Rachel Monroe waited until everyone was seated before opening the folder labeled Brandon Pierce. The folder wasn't large. It didn't need to be. The truth rarely required excessive decoration. Across the table, Brandon sat straighter than before. His confidence remained visible, but it looked forced now, like someone consciously maintaining an image. Rachel glanced toward him. "Mr. Pierce, I'd like to discuss the Mercedes-Benz S-Class currently assigned to your account." Brandon nodded. "No problem." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Rachel continued. "How long have you been driving that vehicle?" "A few months." "Do you consider it your primary vehicle?" "Yes." Rachel made a note, then looked up again. "And who owns the vehicle?" Brandon didn't hesitate. "My company." The room became quiet. Yahir didn't move, didn't react, didn't even look at Brandon. He simply listened. Rachel allowed several seconds to pass. Then she reached into the folder. "Interesting." She placed a document on the table. "Because this appears to be the rental agreement." Brandon's expression didn't change immediately, but his eyes moved toward the paperwork. Rachel continued. "The agreement identifies Great Lakes Executive Rentals as the owner." Silence. Then Brandon shifted slightly. "It's a lease arrangement." "Correct." Rachel nodded. "A lease arrangement." She slid another document forward. "The vehicle is owned by Great Lakes Executive Rentals." Another document. "The title is held by Great Lakes Executive Rentals." Another. "The insurance policy is held by Great Lakes Executive Rentals." Another. "The maintenance responsibility belongs to Great Lakes Executive Rentals." She folded her hands. "So, when exactly did your company own the vehicle?" No answer arrived immediately. The silence lasted long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Eventually, Brandon cleared his throat. "I may have misspoken." Rachel nodded politely. "Of course. No sarcasm, no aggression, just patience. The most dangerous kind." Because Rachel never needed people to expose themselves. She simply gave them room. Brandon adjusted his tie. "The vehicle was leased through my business, Pierce Premier Realty." "Yes." Rachel picked up another document. "Let's discuss that." Yahir noticed Robert Hensley, Vanessa's attorney, beginning to look uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable, because the direction of the conversation was becoming obvious. Rachel placed business records onto the table. Corporate filings, registration records, bank references, account documents, each connected to Brandon's company. "Mr. Pierce," she said calmly, "would you agree these records represent your business information?" "Yes." "Good." Another document appeared. "This is the information submitted during your rental application." Brandon nodded. Rachel compared the pages, one beside the other. Then she asked the question. "Can you explain why these records don't match?" Brandon frowned. "What do you mean?" Rachel pointed. "The addresses differ." Silence. "The account information differs." More silence. "The business references differ." The room became very still. Brandon looked toward his attorney. His attorney avoided eye contact, not a good sign. Rachel continued. "The differences are small," she tapped the paperwork. "But they exist." Brandon shifted in his chair. "I'd have to review everything." "Of course." Rachel nodded. "Take your time." The answer sounded harmless. It wasn't, because every additional second forced Brandon to sit beside the documents, and the documents weren't helping him. Yahir watched Vanessa. Her attention remained fixed on the table. Not Brandon, not Rachel, the documents, as if she were seeing parts of Brandon's life for the first time. Rachel moved on. "Let's discuss payment history." A new stack appeared. Rental invoices, extension requests, late notices, payment adjustments. Yahir recognized every document. He had reviewed them weeks earlier. Now they were entering the record. "Mr. Pierce," Rachel said, "have you ever missed a payment on the Mercedes lease?" Brandon hesitated. "Not significantly." Rachel smiled slightly. The smile of someone holding receipts. "Would you consider 23 days significant?" She displayed a late payment notice, then another, 3 separate incidents, 3 separate delays. The room remained silent. Brandon's jaw tightened. Rachel wasn't finished. "Would you consider outside financial assistance significant?" Now, Brandon looked directly at her, for the first time all afternoon. "What does that mean?" Rachel opened another folder, a much smaller one, the financial transfer records. Yahir already knew what was coming. Still, he watched carefully, because moments like this revealed character. Rachel placed the first transfer on the table, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. Every payment linked to the same source, Vanessa Graham. No one spoke. The papers spoke loudly enough. Brandon looked away. Vanessa froze. Robert Hensley lowered his eyes toward the documents. The reaction told its own story. Rachel's voice remained calm. "Can you explain why Mrs. Graham repeatedly transferred money connected to your vehicle obligations?" Brandon swallowed. "It was a personal matter." "Personal, yes." Rachel nodded. "Was it business-related? No. Investment-related? No. Loan-related? No." Every answer narrowed the possibilities. Everyone in the room understood it, including Vanessa. Rachel continued. "Then why was Mrs. Graham paying obligations connected to your luxury vehicle?" No answer. Another silence. Longer this time. The kind that felt uncomfortable, because truth was approaching, and everyone knew it. Rachel finally moved to the next section. GPS records. The stack was thick, detailed, difficult to dispute. She displayed location logs, dates, times, routes, vehicle activity, one entry after another. Then hotel visits appeared. Amway Grand Plaza. Repeatedly. Several overnight stays. Several matching dates, several matching records. Rachel placed valet reports beside them. Then parking receipts, then access logs. The timeline assembled itself, methodically, piece by piece, like a puzzle. Brandon stopped making eye contact entirely. Vanessa's confidence continued shrinking. The room no longer felt like a divorce deposition. It felt like an audit, and audits were unforgiving. Then Rachel reached the most important document: unauthorized driver reports. The pages landed softly on the table, but their impact was immediate. She turned toward Brandon. "Do you recall signing the rental agreement?" "Yes." "Do you recall the section regarding unauthorized drivers?" "Generally." Rachel slid the agreement forward. "The section is highlighted." Brandon said nothing. Rachel continued. "The lease specifically prohibits unapproved drivers." Another page appeared. "These reports indicate repeated violations." Another. "And repeated warnings." Another. "Would you agree with that?" Brandon stared at the paperwork. Finally, he nodded. Slightly, reluctantly. Rachel turned toward Vanessa. Not accusing, not emotional, just factual. "The system repeatedly identified Mrs. Graham as the operator." Silence. Rachel placed additional records beside the reports. Location matches, access times, vehicle logs, everything aligned. The evidence didn't rely on assumptions. It relied on patterns. And the patterns were undeniable. Then Rachel closed the folder. The room became still again. Everyone sensed something important approaching, because Rachel had saved the strongest point for last. She turned toward Yahir. "Mr. Graham?" "Yes." Rachel handed him a single document, a prepared authorization form. Simple, direct, official. Then she looked toward the room. Based on the violations documented within the lease agreement, Great Lakes Executive Rentals possesses the contractual right to recover the vehicle. No one spoke. Vanessa blinked. Once, twice, as if processing the statement. Brandon looked genuinely alarmed for the first time all day. Not embarrassed, alarmed. Rachel continued. The violations include unauthorized operation, inaccurate business information, and multiple compliance concerns. She nodded toward Yahir. As owner, Mr. Graham may authorize recovery at any time. The reality settled heavily over the room. The Mercedes, the symbol, the image, the status, the centerpiece of Brandon's carefully constructed identity, wasn't his, never had been, and now everyone knew it. Rachel placed a pen beside the authorization, then looked toward Yahir. The room waited. Brandon waited. Vanessa waited. Even Robert Hensley stopped writing. Yahir looked down at the document. Calm, steady, patient. Then he signed his name. The pen moved across the paper in less than 3 seconds. No speech, no anger, no satisfaction. Just a signature. A simple signature that transformed months of deception into a contractual consequence. Rachel collected the document, placed it into her folder, and quietly informed everyone that the recovery process would begin immediately. Across the table, Brandon finally understood something important. The car had never been his, and very soon neither would the illusion attached to it. The repossession happened 4 days later, on a gray Friday afternoon. Cold rain drifted across downtown Grand Rapids in thin sheets, turning sidewalks dark and reflective. Traffic moved slowly along Monroe Avenue. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Most never noticed the recovery truck waiting quietly near the entrance of Riverhouse condominiums. The truck had arrived 30 minutes earlier. Not secretly, not aggressively, legally, professionally. Every document had already been reviewed, every authorization verified, every procedure approved. The recovery company worked regularly with Great Lakes Executive Rentals. Nothing about this operation was unusual, except the people involved. At 4:42 p.m., the black Mercedes finally appeared. The sedan rolled into the private entrance lane beneath the condominium tower. Its headlights reflected off the wet pavement. Inside, Brandon Pierce sat behind the wheel. Vanessa occupied the passenger seat. Neither noticed the recovery truck. Not at first. The Mercedes stopped beneath the covered entrance. A valet approached. Brandon stepped out. Expensive coat, leather shoes, confident posture, even now. Even after the deposition. Even after the documents, even after the ownership records. Part of him still seemed determined to maintain the image. Vanessa exited moments later. She looked distracted, tired. The confidence she carried into the divorce filing had diminished considerably over the previous weeks. Reality was beginning to catch up. The recovery supervisor waited until both individuals moved away from the vehicle. Then he approached. Professional, calm, prepared. "Mr. Pierce?" Brandon turned. "Yeah." The supervisor handed him a folder. Brandon glanced down. The expression on his face changed almost immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. "What is this?" The supervisor remained polite. "Vehicle recovery authorization." Brandon stared at him. Then at the paperwork. Then back at the Mercedes. The rain continued falling. Steady, cold, almost gentle. The supervisor pointed toward the documents. "The vehicle is being recovered under authority of Great Lakes Executive Rentals." For several seconds, Brandon didn't speak. It looked as though his brain needed time to process what his eyes were reading. Then came the first reaction. "This has to be a mistake." The supervisor shook his head. "No, sir." Brandon's voice became sharper. "I have a lease." "Yes, sir." "I have payments." "Yes, sir." "I have rights." The supervisor nodded. "Those rights are addressed within the documents." The calm response only made Brandon more frustrated. Because anger requires resistance. The recovery supervisor wasn't resisting. He was simply following procedure. Vanessa stepped closer. "What exactly is happening?" The supervisor handed her a second copy. She began reading. Yahir wasn't there. He had intentionally chosen not to attend. There was nothing for him to prove, nothing for him to witness. The documents would handle everything. Still, Rachel had arranged for updates, and several people present knew exactly who ultimately owned the vehicle. Vanessa read the first page, then the second, then stopped. The rain collected on the edges of the paperwork. She barely noticed, because one sentence had captured her attention. Vehicle ownership, Great Lakes Executive Rentals. Her eyes moved lower. Authorized by Yahir Graham. The name appeared clearly, unmistakably. Vanessa stared at it. For a moment, she looked completely lost. Not angry. Lost, as though she had suddenly realized how much she never understood. Brandon recovered first. His frustration escalated quickly. "This is ridiculous." The supervisor remained calm. "Sir, I understand your frustration." "No, you don't." Brandon pointed toward the vehicle. "I've been driving that car for months." "Yes, sir." "I have clients." "Yes, sir." "I have appointments." "Yes, sir." Every answer sounded identical, professional, controlled, unmovable. The recovery supervisor had probably heard every version of this conversation before. Different people, different vehicles, same emotions. Brandon stepped toward the Mercedes. The supervisor stepped slightly sideways. Not confrontational, just procedural. "We need the keys, sir." The sentence landed harder than anything else. The keys. Symbols mattered. Especially to people who built identities around them. Brandon hesitated. The key fob remained in his hand, the same key he had proudly displayed at the Whitney. The same key he had used to project success. The same key Vanessa had admired. Now, it looked smaller somehow. Ordinary. Just a piece of plastic and metal. Vanessa looked at him, waiting. The rain intensified. Water ran across the sidewalk. The city moved around them. No one stopped, no one cared, because to everyone else it was simply another vehicle recovery. Nothing more. Eventually, Brandon surrendered the keys. The supervisor accepted them politely, then handed them to the recovery operator. The process moved quickly, efficiently, without drama. The Mercedes was inspected, photographed, documented, secured. Within minutes, hydraulic equipment began lifting the vehicle. Brandon watched in silence. The reality was impossible to ignore now. The car was leaving. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. Vanessa's phone appeared in her hand. She stared at the screen, then selected a contact. Yahir. The call connected, rang, went unanswered. She tried again and again and again. Each call ended the same way. No answer. Not because Yahir was avoiding her, because he was working. At that exact moment, he stood inside a conference room reviewing quarterly transportation reports with senior managers from Graham Mobility Ventures. Business continued. Life continued. The Mercedes wasn't occupying his attention anymore. The facts had already spoken. Back downtown, the vehicle settled onto the recovery truck. Straps tightened, inspections completed, paperwork signed, finished. The entire process lasted less than 25 minutes. Months of illusion ended in less than half an hour. Brandon looked defeated, not broken, just exposed. The difference mattered. People often recover from financial losses. Recovering from public exposure is harder, especially when identity depends on perception. The truck driver climbed into the cab. The engine started. Then the truck pulled away from the curb, slowly, deliberately. The black Mercedes disappeared into rainy Grand Rapids traffic. Gone. Vanessa watched until the taillights vanished. Only then did she lower her phone. The unanswered calls remained visible on the screen. 6 attempts, no response. She looked older somehow, not physically, emotionally, because certainty had abandoned her. The future she imagined with Brandon now looked different. Smaller, less stable, less impressive. Perhaps for the first time she was seeing Brandon without the Mercedes, without the image, without the symbols. Just Brandon. The realization appeared uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Meanwhile, 40 miles away, Rachel Monroe received a confirmation that the recovery had been completed successfully. She immediately forwarded the report to Yahir. Simple, professional. Recovered without incident. Vehicle secured. Compliance process complete. Yahir read the message after finishing his meeting, then placed the phone back into his pocket. No celebration. No satisfaction. Just another completed process. One more issue resolved through proper channels. That evening, however, another report arrived. This one came from Marcus Bell. The subject line immediately caught Yahir's attention. Additional financial findings. Yahir opened the attachment. Several new documents appeared. Bank statements, transfer histories, account summaries, more evidence, much more evidence. As he reviewed the first pages, a pattern emerged. The financial situation surrounding Brandon looked significantly worse than previously believed. Far worse. Several obligations remained unpaid. Several balances hovered dangerously low. And one particular account showed activity that immediately stood out. Because the money inside it wasn't disappearing, it was growing. The account name appeared near the top of the page. Fresh Start Fund. Yahir stared at the balance, then read the accompanying notes. For the first time since this investigation began, he realized the divorce wasn't simply about betrayal. Someone had been preparing for a very specific financial outcome, and the numbers suggested that outcome was much closer than anyone realized. The numbers finally spoke. And unlike people, numbers didn't change their stories. 3 weeks after the Mercedes was recovered, the financial review phase of the divorce entered a new stage. By then, the emotional drama had largely disappeared. No more surprise revelations. No more dramatic confrontations. The case had evolved into what Rachel Monroe preferred most. Documentation. Statements. Records. Verified facts. On a cold November morning, Yahir sat inside Rachel's conference room reviewing the latest disclosures. A stack of financial reports occupied nearly half the table. Bank statements, investment summaries, asset valuations, business audits, tax records. Months earlier, Vanessa had believed the divorce would revolve around appearances. Who seemed more successful? Who looked more sympathetic? Who told the better story? Instead, it had become a review of numbers. And numbers were not on her side. Rachel adjusted her glasses while reading through another report. Then she looked up. They found more? Yahir nodded. I assumed they would. Rachel slid a document across the table. Marcus Bell's latest forensic review. The report focused entirely on financial transfers. Not assumptions, not accusations. Transfers. Money leaving one account and appearing somewhere else. Simple. Traceable. Difficult to argue with, Yahir studied the first page. The findings expanded on everything Marcus had already uncovered. The total amount transferred from Vanessa to Brandon exceeded $70,000. The exact number no longer mattered. The pattern did. Repeated transfers. Repeated support. Repeated efforts to sustain Brandon's lifestyle. Several transactions had originated from marital accounts. Others came from personal savings. A few originated from an emergency fund established years earlier by Yahir. Rachel tapped a highlighted section. This is the important part. Yahir looked closer. The transfers were categorized. Vehicle support, housing support, business support, personal support. The categories painted a remarkably clear picture. Brandon hadn't simply benefited from Vanessa's attention. He had benefited from her money. Repeatedly. Extensively. Systematically. Rachel folded her hands. The court is going to notice this. They already have. True. But there was a difference between noticing something and understanding it. The latest report made understanding unavoidable. Across multiple pages, Marcus had reconstructed the entire financial relationship. The results looked almost like a business partnership. Only one side consistently contributed capital, and it wasn't Brandon. The review continued. One report led to another. One account led to another. Eventually, they reached the Fresh Start Fund, the account that first appeared months earlier, the account connected to Brandon and Vanessa, the account that originally raised Yahir's suspicions. Now they possessed complete records. Rachel opened the file. The balance history appeared immediately. Deposit after deposit. Transfer after transfer. Every movement documented. Every transaction dated. Yahir examined the timeline. The account had not been growing through business activity. It had been growing through contributions. Vanessa's contributions. The realization removed any remaining doubt. She hadn't been preparing for uncertainty. She had been preparing for departure. The plan stretched back nearly a year, perhaps longer. Rachel leaned back. There's no ambiguity anymore. No. That's good. Yahir understood what she meant. Clarity mattered. Especially in court. Emotional disputes often produced conflicting stories. Financial records rarely did. Around noon, they joined a settlement review conference with opposing counsel. The atmosphere felt noticeably different from earlier meetings. Robert Hensley no longer projected the confidence he carried during the initial filing. The reason was obvious. His client's assumptions had collapsed. The asset disclosures alone had changed everything. Now, the financial records were doing even more damage. The discussion began with routine matters: property evaluations, timeline reviews, disclosure confirmations. Then Rachel introduced the transfer reports. The room grew quiet almost immediately. Robert reviewed the first pages, then the second, then the third. Each page made his expression slightly more serious. Eventually, he lowered the file. These numbers have been verified, Rachel nodded. Multiple times. Robert looked down again. No further questions followed, because there weren't many questions left to ask. The records were clear. Vanessa's attorney understood that. More importantly, he understood the court would understand it too. The discussion moved toward asset classification, another critical area. Years earlier, Yahir had structured his holdings carefully, not because he expected a divorce, because good business required protection. The strategy now proved valuable. Graham Holdings, Graham Mobility Ventures, Great Lakes Executive Rentals, various investment entities. Each possessed clear ownership histories, clear formation dates, clear separation from marital property. Every structure had documentation. Every document had dates. Every date mattered. Rachel presented the records calmly. No grand speeches, no complicated arguments, just evidence. The result became increasingly obvious. Much of what Vanessa expected to receive simply wasn't subject to division. Not because Yahir had hidden anything, because ownership existed long before the marriage reached its current stage. Robert understood it. The financial experts understood it. Eventually, Vanessa would understand it too. The afternoon brought another development, this time involving Brandon. Separate civil concerns had begun emerging from the vehicle investigation. Nothing criminal, nothing sensational, just consequences. Contract violations, misrepresentations, compliance issues, potential reimbursement claims. The type of consequences that appeared when documentation accumulated over time. Yahir didn't pursue them aggressively. He didn't need to. The contracts already existed. The terms already existed. The process simply followed its course. Rachel summarized it best. The system is doing what it's supposed to do, Yahir agreed. That was exactly what was happening. No revenge, no personal attacks, no emotional retaliation, just systems functioning properly. Late that afternoon, another conference call ended. The room became quiet again. Rachel closed several folders, then looked toward Yahir. They're starting to understand. Who? Both of them. Yahir knew she was right, because reality had become difficult to avoid. The Mercedes was gone. The ownership structures were documented. The financial transfers were documented. The assumptions were collapsing, piece by piece. Rachel stood and walked toward the window. Snow flurries drifted lightly outside. Winter was arriving. The interesting thing, she said, is that none of this happened suddenly. Yahir waited. They built their expectations gradually. She turned back toward him. And expectations are hard to abandon. That observation stayed with him, because she was describing more than legal strategy. She was describing Vanessa. Months earlier, she had imagined a future, a different life, a different partner, a different level of success. Every decision since then had reinforced that vision. Now, reality was forcing revisions, painful revisions. The following week brought formal recommendations from financial reviewers. The conclusions aligned almost perfectly with Rachel's expectations. Marital assets would be divided. Certain accounts would be adjusted. Specific transfers would be considered. But the larger empire Vanessa imagined accessing didn't belong to the marital estate. The distinction mattered enormously. By Friday afternoon, settlement discussions were no longer hypothetical. They were becoming necessary. Robert Hensley requested preliminary negotiations. The request itself revealed how much had changed. Earlier in the case, Vanessa pursued aggressive claims. Now her attorney wanted conversations. Conversations usually appeared when confidence disappeared. Rachel reviewed the request, then smiled slightly. They want to talk. Yahir looked up from his paperwork. About settlement. Yes? He wasn't surprised. Not anymore. The facts had been moving in this direction for weeks. The financial reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The next stage was obvious. Negotiation, compromise, resolution. Rachel closed the final folder and placed it neatly on top of the others. Get ready. Yahir nodded. For what? Rachel's smile widened slightly. The moment expectations meet actual numbers. Outside, snow continued falling over Grand Rapids. Inside, months of evidence had finally done their work. And somewhere across town, Vanessa was about to learn exactly how different reality looked from the future she thought she had already secured. The settlement meeting took place on a snowy Thursday morning. Grand Rapids looked muted beneath a fresh layer of white. Traffic moved carefully. Storefronts opened slowly. The city felt quieter than usual. Inside a conference room on the 8th floor of Monroe and Bartlett, however, several months of conflict were approaching their conclusion. Yahir arrived first, as usual. A cup of black coffee rested beside him. Several folders sat neatly arranged on the table. Nothing dramatic, nothing excessive, everything prepared. Rachel Monroe entered a few minutes later carrying the final settlement package. She placed it on the table, then looked toward Yahir. "They're coming." Yahir nodded. Neither spoke after that. There wasn't much left to say. The facts had already been established. The numbers had already been reviewed. The ownership structures had already been verified. Now came the final stage. Acceptance. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room door opened. Vanessa entered first. The difference was noticeable immediately. Not because of her appearance, she still dressed well, still carried herself carefully, still maintained the polished image she valued. The change lived somewhere else. The confidence was gone. Not entirely, but enough. Enough for Yahir to notice, enough for Rachel to notice, enough for everyone to notice. Robert Hensley followed behind her. His expression looked professional as always. Yet months of difficult financial reviews had clearly worn down his optimism. Everyone took their seats. The meeting began. No introductions, no speeches, no grand statements. Just business. Rachel opened the settlement packet. The first pages summarized assets. The second outlined financial allocations. The third addressed reimbursement matters. Every section relied upon documentation already established during discovery. Nothing surprising. Nothing hidden. Everything supported. Robert reviewed the packet carefully. Vanessa followed along beside him. Page after page, line after line. The silence grew heavier with each passing minute, because expectations continued colliding with reality. Eventually, Robert lowered the packet. His voice remained professional. "We've reviewed the proposal." Rachel nodded. "Good." A pause followed. Then Robert asked the question everyone expected. "Is there flexibility?" Rachel folded her hands. "A little." The answer was honest. There was some room, not much, but some. That was how serious negotiations worked. Neither side expected perfection. They expected practicality. The discussion continued. Several provisions were adjusted. A timeline changed. Certain property allocations shifted slightly. Minor revisions, nothing major, nothing affecting the larger outcome. Throughout the entire conversation, Yahir barely spoke. Not because he wasn't paying attention, because Rachel handled the legal strategy perfectly. There was no need for him to dominate the room. Facts already occupied enough space. Around 10:30, something unexpected happened. Vanessa spoke directly to him, not through attorneys, not through paperwork, directly. "Yahir." He looked up. Her voice sounded different, softer, less certain, less rehearsed. "Can we talk for a minute?" Rachel glanced toward Yahir. The choice was his. He nodded once. The attorneys stepped outside. The conference room door closed. For the first time in months, Yahir and Vanessa sat alone together. Silence lingered. Several seconds passed before Vanessa finally spoke. "I didn't think it would happen like this." Yahir waited. The statement wasn't a question. It didn't require a response. Vanessa looked down at the table, then continued. "I thought I understood everything." There it was. The truth. Not the legal truth, the personal truth. She believed she understood her life, her marriage, her future, the people around her, and now she realized she hadn't. Yahir remained quiet. Not because he wanted to punish her, because silence often allowed people to finish their thoughts. Eventually she did. "I never knew." "Knew what?" "The companies, the holdings, the fleet, the investments." Her eyes moved toward him. "You never told me." The statement hung between them. Yahir considered it carefully, then answered honestly. "You never asked." Vanessa looked away. The answer hurt. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. For years she had judged his truck, his clothes, his schedule. his garage. She never investigated beyond what she could see, never looked beneath the surface, never asked questions she wasn't already convinced she knew the answers to. Several moments passed. Then Vanessa said something else, something Yahir had expected eventually. "Do you think we could have fixed this?" The question sounded genuine, not strategic, not manipulative, just genuine. Yahir thought about it. The affair, the lies, the money, the planning, the transfers, the future she built with someone else. Then he answered, "I don't know." Because that was the truth. Not yes, not no, just uncertainty. Some things couldn't be measured. Some questions arrived too late. Vanessa nodded slowly, as though she already knew the answer. The silence returned. This time it felt final, not hostile, just finished. Eventually, the attorneys returned. The settlement discussion resumed. The remaining issues moved quickly. Most had already been decided by the evidence. By noon, only signatures remained. Rachel presented the final version. Neatly organized, clearly written, every number verified, every provision supported. Vanessa reviewed it carefully. Very carefully. This time, there were no arguments, no objections, no surprise demands, just reality. The settlement granted her a fair portion of marital assets, appropriate accounts, appropriate distributions, appropriate considerations, but far less than she once imagined. The massive fortune she believed existed inside the marriage remained largely untouched, because it had never been part of the marital estate. The documentation established that clearly. The law followed the documentation. Simple, predictable, unemotional, exactly as Rachel had promised. Vanessa reached the final page, the signature page. Her hand paused briefly. Not long, just a moment. Long enough to acknowledge what the signature represented. Then she signed, one signature, months of conflict reduced to ink on paper. Robert signed next. Rachel followed. The documents became official. The hardest part was over. Afterward, people gathered their materials. Folders closed, pens disappeared, chairs moved. The room gradually emptied. Vanessa remained seated for several seconds longer. Her eyes settled on Yahir one final time. No anger, no accusations, no bitterness, only a quiet understanding. Perhaps for the first time in years. Then she stood, picked up her coat, and walked toward the door. The moment felt strangely ordinary. No dramatic ending, no emotional scene. Just a woman leaving a chapter of her life behind. The door closed softly. Rachel released a slow breath. "Well?" Yahir smiled faintly. "Well?" Rachel gathered the final paperwork. "How do you feel?" The question deserved consideration. Relieved, maybe. Victorious, not really. Angry, not anymore. Mostly he felt something else. Finished. The endless uncertainty was gone. The guessing, the waiting, the investigation. The legal process, all of it, finished. Rachel seemed to understand. She nodded. That's usually the best outcome. Outside the conference room window, snow continued falling across Grand Rapids. The city moved forward. Cars passed below. People walked sidewalks. Life continued, as it always did. Yahir stood, buttoned his coat, collected his coffee cup, then headed toward the elevator. The divorce wasn't officially finalized yet. A few procedural steps remained, but the outcome was settled. The direction was clear. As the elevator descended, Yahir glanced at his hands. Steady, calm, the same hands that rebuilt engines, built businesses, signed contracts. And now signed the final agreement ending a marriage. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to prove. And somewhere behind him, several floors above a signed settlement rested quietly on a conference table. a reminder that facts eventually arrive, even when people spend years believing something else. The divorce became official on a cold morning in January. There was no celebration, no dramatic sense of victory, no moment where Yahir Graham stood on a mountaintop feeling triumphant. Life simply continued. The same way it always had, the paperwork was finalized. The court entered the judgment. The attorneys exchanged final documents, and then the system moved on to the next case. That was one of the lessons Yahir appreciated most. Real justice rarely arrived with music and applause. Most of the time it arrived in filing cabinets. Court orders, contracts, signed documents, quiet things. A week after the final decree, Yahir returned to the routine he understood best: work. The garage looked exactly the same. The brick building still sat on the west side of Grand Rapids. The service bays still opened at 7:30. The smell of motor oil still greeted customers every morning. Mike Sanders still arrived before most employees. Coffee still waited near the parts counter. Nothing about the place suggested that its owner had spent months navigating one of the most complicated periods of his life. That was how Yahir preferred it. One morning, while reviewing repair orders, he noticed something interesting. The employees were treating him differently. Not dramatically, subtly, a little more respectfully, a little more carefully. At first, he couldn't identify why. Then he realized. People knew more than he thought. Not details, not confidential information, but enough. Grand Rapids wasn't a large city. News traveled, especially among business circles, especially after Brandon Pierce's public image began unraveling. Nobody discussed it openly. Nobody asked questions. But they knew. They knew Yahir had faced something difficult, and they knew he handled it quietly. That mattered, more than most people realized. Around noon, Mike walked into the office carrying a work order. Before leaving, he hesitated, then finally spoke. "Can I say something?" Yahir looked up. "Sure." Mike nodded slowly. Most guys would have blown everything up. The statement hung in the air. Yahir understood what he meant. The affair, the divorce, the investigations, the Mercedes, everything. Mike continued. "You didn't." Then he left. Nothing more. No speech, no lecture, just an observation. Yahir returned to work. But the comment stayed with him. Because Mike was right. Exploding would have been easy. Anyone could do that. Patience required something else. The months passed quickly. Winter gradually gave way to spring. Business remained strong, then stronger still. Several transportation contracts expanded. A regional healthcare network renewed a fleet agreement. An executive transportation service signed a multi-year deal. Great Lakes Executive Rentals continued growing. Quietly, methodically, exactly the way Yahir liked it. One afternoon, Derek Lawson stopped by the garage. The two men sat inside the office reviewing quarterly reports. Revenue looked excellent. Fleet utilization remained high. Corporate accounts continued expanding. Derek smiled while turning pages. "Not bad. Not bad," Derek laughed. "You know, most people would call this exceptional." Yahir shrugged. "Most people exaggerate." "That's true." Derek pointed toward one section of the report. "We're adding 12 more vehicles next quarter." Yahir nodded. The expansion made sense. Demand supported it. The business could absorb it comfortably. The conversation shifted toward acquisitions, then staffing, then future opportunities. Hours passed. Eventually, Derek closed the folder. "One more thing." Yahir waited. Derek smiled. "The Mercedes." Yahir raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "It's ready." That made him laugh. The black Mercedes had spent weeks undergoing inspections, servicing compliance reviews, and reconditioning after recovery. Now it was back in perfect condition, ready for another client, ready for another contract, ready for another life. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Later that afternoon, Yahir visited the Great Lakes Executive Rentals facility. Rows of vehicles sat beneath bright showroom lights, luxury SUVs, executive sedans, premium transportation units, clean, organized, professional. Near the center of the floor sat the Mercedes, polished, detailed, perfect. No evidence remained of Brandon Pierce. No evidence remained of the arguments, the lies, the affair, the recovery, nothing. The vehicle had simply returned to inventory, a business asset once again. Yahir walked around it slowly, then stopped. For a brief moment he remembered the rainy night outside his bedroom window. Vanessa laughing. The door opening, the illusion, the assumptions. Everything that followed. Months of investigation, months of legal proceedings, months of documentation. And now the car sat quietly under showroom lights waiting for a new customer. The simplicity of that fact felt strangely satisfying. Not because Brandon lost it, because reality had reclaimed it. A few weeks later, another piece of information reached him. Not through investigators, not through attorneys, just ordinary business conversation. Brandon Pierce had largely disappeared from local luxury circles. The invitations slowed. The appearances became less frequent. The social media posts became less extravagant. Some people quietly stopped returning his calls. Others moved on. Yahir didn't celebrate the news. He barely reacted. Consequences belonged to the people who created them, not to him. Vanessa's situation appeared different. She had moved into a smaller apartment near the northern edge of the city. Nothing wrong with the apartment. Nothing shameful, just ordinary. Very ordinary. The type of place she once mocked. That irony wasn't lost on Yahir either. Still, he felt no desire to punish her. No desire to watch her struggle. That chapter had ended. Holding on to resentment would only keep it alive. Spring eventually arrived in full. The city changed colors again. Trees returned, parks filled. People spent more time outside. One Friday evening, Yahir finished work later than usual. The garage had finally emptied. The service bays were quiet. Most employees had gone home. The building settled into familiar silence. Before leaving, he stopped by the transportation facility one final time. The Mercedes was gone. Leased again, a new client, a new contract, a new beginning, exactly as it should be. Derek noticed him looking at the empty space. Picked up this morning. Yahir nodded. Good. Funny, isn't it? What is? Derek smiled. All that drama. He pointed toward the empty space. And now it's just another vehicle. Yahir looked across the fleet. Rows of cars, rows of contracts, rows of opportunities, business, nothing more. He smiled slightly. That's what it always was, Derek laughed. Because that simple statement captured everything. For Brandon, the Mercedes represented status. For Vanessa, it represented success. For Yahir, it had always been inventory. Just another asset. Just another line item, just another tool. The difference in perspective explained nearly the entire story. As the evening sun faded across Grand Rapids, Yahir locked the facility and headed home. The road ahead felt clearer now. Not because life was perfect, because life was finally uncomplicated again. And after everything that happened that felt like more than enough. Summer arrived quietly in western Michigan. The legal documents were finished. The investigations were finished. The explanations were finished. For the first time in nearly 2 years, Yahir Graham's life no longer revolved around solving a problem. That realization felt unfamiliar. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. One Saturday morning in June, he left home before sunrise. The roads were nearly empty. Streetlights still glowed above the quiet neighborhoods of Grand Rapids. His old Ford F-150 moved steadily through the darkness. The truck remained exactly where it had always been. Paid for, reliable, unimpressive. Yahir smiled slightly as he drove. Vanessa used to hate that truck. She once called it embarrassing, a symbol of small ambitions, a symbol of someone unwilling to grow. Yet the truck remained. The marriage didn't. That irony no longer hurt. Now it simply existed. The eastern horizon slowly brightened. Orange and gold colors spread across the sky. Yahir headed west toward Lake Michigan. He had made the drive many times over the years. Whenever life became noisy, the lake helped restore perspective. The shoreline didn't care about business titles, or divorce settlements, or luxury cars. The water simply existed, steady, patient, ancient. By 7 o'clock, he parked near a quiet stretch of beach north of Holland. The morning air felt cool. Waves rolled steadily against the shore. A few joggers moved along the sand. Several fishermen stood near the water. Otherwise, the beach remained almost empty. Yahir walked slowly toward the shoreline, hands in his pockets, no phone, no meetings, no schedules, just silence. The lake stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For a while, he simply watched and thought. Not about Vanessa, not about Brandon, not even about the divorce. He thought about time, the strange way people spend years building something, then spend months watching it change: marriage, business, friendships, companies. Everything worked that way. Nothing remained fixed forever. The lesson wasn't new, but it felt clearer now. A seagull landed several yards away. The bird watched the water, uninterested in everything else. Yahir laughed softly. Simple creatures often seemed wiser than people. They didn't chase status. They didn't compare themselves to others. They simply lived. The thought stayed with him, because so much of what happened could be traced back to comparison. Vanessa compared him to other men. Brandon compared himself to wealthier people. Both spent years chasing images that eventually collapsed. Yahir never cared much about images. That difference had protected him. Around mid-morning, he returned to the truck. Before leaving, he glanced back at the lake one final time. The water looked exactly the same, unmoved by human drama. There was something comforting about that. The drive back to Grand Rapids felt peaceful. No phone calls interrupted him. No legal emergencies appeared. No investigators needed updates. Life had finally become ordinary again. And ordinary felt surprisingly valuable. The following months continued much the same way. Business remained strong. The fleet expanded. New contracts arrived. Several younger managers stepped into larger leadership roles. The companies no longer required Yahir's constant attention. That was intentional. Years earlier, he built systems. Good systems created freedom. Now, he was finally enjoying some of that freedom. One afternoon, Rachel Monroe stopped by the garage. Not as an attorney, as a friend. The two sat outside near the service bays drinking coffee. Summer heat drifted across the parking lot. Employees worked nearby. Customers came and went. Life moved forward. Rachel looked around. "You seem happier." Yahir considered the observation. Maybe, not happier exactly, lighter. The difference mattered. Happiness came and went. Peace lasted longer. Rachel seemed to understand. "You know what surprised me most?" "What?" "The fact you never tried to destroy either of them." Yahir looked across the parking lot. A young mechanic was helping an elderly customer load groceries into her car. The simple act held his attention for a moment. Then he answered. There wasn't any point. Rachel laughed. Most people would have disagreed. Many would have wanted revenge. Public humiliation, punishment, some kind of dramatic ending. Yahir never wanted any of that. The truth had already done enough. Facts exposed the affair. Facts exposed the money. Facts exposed the lies. Everything else happened naturally afterward. Rachel eventually stood to leave. Before walking away, she paused. Most people underestimate patience, Yahir nodded. They do. Then she smiled. You should keep it that way. The comment stayed with him, because patience had been the entire story, not wealth, not business, not contracts. Patience. Patience long enough to gather facts. Patience long enough to avoid mistakes. Patience long enough to let reality reveal itself. Months later, on a quiet autumn evening, Yahir found himself standing inside Graham Auto Service after everyone else had gone home. The garage was silent. Tools rested where they belonged. Service bays sat empty. The day was finished. Outside, darkness settled across Grand Rapids. Inside, only a few overhead lights remained on. Yahir walked slowly through the building. The same building Vanessa once viewed as evidence of limitation. The same building many people underestimated. The same building that quietly launched everything else. He stopped near the center service bay, looked around, and smiled. Not because he had won, because he understood something. The garage had never been the beginning, and it had never been the end. It was simply honest work, the foundation beneath everything else, the place where appearances didn't matter, only results. Eventually, he reached the front entrance. His hand settled on the light switch. One by one, the remaining lights disappeared. The building fell quiet, then dark. Yahir stepped outside, locked the door, and listened. Nothing. No lawyers, no court dates, no investigations, no explanations, just the distant sound of traffic moving through the city. Life continuing, exactly as it should. He placed the keys into his pocket, then started walking toward his truck. The same man, yet somehow different. Not richer, not more successful, just clearer. The road ahead remained uncertain. Life always worked that way. But uncertainty no longer bothered him, because he had learned something important. The strongest position wasn't built through appearances. It was built through truth. Truth required no performance, no audience, no luxury vehicle, no validation, only time. As Yahir drove away from the garage that night, the city lights reflected across the windshield. Grand Rapids stretched quietly around him, a place filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. And somewhere among them drove a man who had once watched his wife laugh while climbing into another man's car, a man who could have reacted with anger, a man who chose patience instead. And in the end, patience proved stronger, much stronger. Some people think strength is loud. They imagine strength as confrontation revenge or the ability to dominate a room. But life often teaches a different lesson. Real strength is sometimes the ability to stay calm when emotions demand action. It's the discipline to wait for facts when assumptions would be easier. Yahir never won because he shouted louder. He won because he stayed patient long enough for the truth to reveal itself. Many of us have experienced moments when we felt underestimated, ignored, or judged by appearances. Maybe someone assumed you weren't successful enough, smart enough, connected enough, or important enough. The temptation is always to prove them wrong immediately. Yet the people who build lasting success usually spend less time defending themselves and more time building something real. Over time, reality becomes difficult to hide and impossible to fake. I'd love to hear from you. What country are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Have you ever been in a situation where you stayed quiet and let the truth speak for itself? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else going through a difficult season. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's story features another man who was underestimated for years until one unexpected moment changed everything.